you basically need really, really big differentials to give the market a correct signal and incentive to figure out how to clear that physical overhang.
My name is Mike Mauceli, and this is the Energy Show with REI Energy, where we're energizing your investments and maximizing your tax deductions. Today, we're going to be talking about Canada's new pipeline, and you're going to discover how Canada's new pipeline is impacting American oil and American gas prices and the global economy. My guest today is Rory Johnston. Rory is the founder of Commodity Context. Great to have you on the show today, Rory.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about Commodity Context and your work.
Yeah, so again, thanks for having me. And so my name is Rory Johnston. I'm an oil researcher based in Toronto. My background was historically, I led commodity economics research at Scotiabank here in Toronto, which is Scotiabank's one of the big five Canadian banks. And has historically been the Canadian bank most associated with both the Western Canadian oil sector and the broader commodity sector. So I did a lot of oil and gas work and a lot of base metals work. After that, I left just before COVID, joined a family office, and then COVID happened and oil got really interesting all of a sudden very rapidly. So I started writing Commodity Context for free as a bit of a side hobby just to kind of stay in the sector and to stay connected and to keep writing because I enjoy it. And that I was very thankful and continue to feel blessed that subscribers enjoyed the content. It took off. At the beginning of 2022, I turned on a paywall to see if I could make this my full-time kind of vocation. And again, I'm very grateful that people have kind of put their trust in me to kind of monitor and maintain the oil sector. So, well, it's data-driven. The focus is very visual, so very chart-heavy. I'm not a bull or a bear. I'm really just someone who likes to follow the churn of the market. I think that's part of the fun. And I think if you have a kind of a steady state position, it really kind of mucks up the fun of it because then you're depressed half the time. And in oil, someone's always depressed in oil. So I like to try and be the person that's always with a smile on my face. And that's the kind of energy I like to bring.
Well, we certainly need more people like yourself, out there talking about oil and gas, because the oil business gets such a bad rap. I mean, between the media and the government officials and, everybody, I mean, it's always, let's dump on the oil business, right? I mean, they're the easiest people to go after. They're polluting the economy. They're just doing everything incorrectly, but yet we live in such a great world, where, we have sustainable electricity. I mean, just think what the world would be like without fossil fuels.
Absolutely. And I think, I do a lot of my work, obviously, in Canada. A lot of my clients and my work takes me out to Calgary and broadly into Alberta and Saskatchewan and out east to Newfoundland and the offshore operations there. But I'm in Toronto. And like you said, there isn't a lot of love for oil in Toronto, big kind of cosmopolitan city. I'm one of the few people in the city that really kind of, really enjoys spending my spare time counting barrels and speaking like people with yourself about this sector, about the value, and I think about kind of where it's headed.
Well, I really wanted to dive into this Trans Mountain Pipeline because, I don't know how that got approved by Trudeau's government, but maybe we can kind of start there because, obviously I thought everyone was against pipelines, right?
Yeah, exactly. And, not only approved through Trudeau, but actually built by the Trudeau Liberal government, which I think is kind of an odd kind of enigma when I think, very reasonably, the Liberal government of Canada is not known for its love of the oil sector. So I think we just kind of rewind for a second and, this pipeline, I've been tracking it, the Trans Mountain Expansion Pipeline. I've been tracking it for pretty well the entirety of my career to date. It was initially a plan by Kinder Morgan to expand the existing Trans Mountain Pipeline, which has been in service for upwards of 70 years now. That takes crude oil from the Edmonton area out towards Vancouver, basically, out and you also have some spurs down into kind of northern Washington state. So, there's flow there, and it was about a 300,000 barrel a day pipeline. The Trans Mountain Expansion, or TMX as we'll call it for the rest of this, was a 590,000 barrel a day expansion. So basically tripled the capacity on the line. And it was initially proposed in the early 2010s and was one of three pipelines that was really kind of trying to churn and kind of work its way through the system alongside both, the Keystone expansion, Keystone XL pipeline, as well as the Energy East pipeline, which was a very large pipeline that was meant to go from Alberta all the way out to Canada's east coast, out towards New Brunswick and towards the Irving refinery out there, and then for additional export out of and to the Atlantic basin instead of the Pacific. But for anyone that's watched the industry knows, Canadian pipelines have had a very hard go of it. The Keystone XL pipeline was obviously first killed by the Obama administration, then resurrected by the Trump administration, and then killed again by the Biden administration. So that's kind of been a huge political football. The Energy East pipeline itself had its own challenges, mostly related to Quebec and some of the kind of anti-oil elements in Canada's east. And then Trans Mountain and the Trans Mountain expansion, TMX, was going through it looked like the most promising. I think it always makes sense. It makes sense to put Canada's oil, which is largely located in Alberta, out towards the Pacific Basin. The challenge is you have the Rocky Mountains in the way. It's not easy to build a pipeline through the Rocky Mountains, I think, as anyone reasonably can guess, particularly given the fact that British Columbia is also a province where the politics are generally anti-pipeline, particularly anti-oil sands pipeline. So the challenge is that the law. So basically, they kept having all these court challenges, and Trans Mountain, Kinder Morgan at the time kept winning, but it was like death of a thousand cuts. It was delay, and this pipeline was becoming this massive headache. So eventually, Kinder Morgan announced that it was basically it was planning on not building or delaying or suspending, production or construction of the pipeline, and that's when the Trudeau government, in its early days, I want to say this was the first couple of years of this new Liberal government, which had a majority at the time. They came in and bought the pipeline. They bought the legacy Trans Mountain system as well as the plans for the expansion. And now they've built it. It was completed very recently at the beginning of the summer. And now it is now in full operation. The challenge is that the pipeline came in hugely over budget, partly because I think reasonably, the government is going to be more expensive to build these things than a private corporation, as well as you had a bunch of other things that made it far more difficult to build. You had COVID, which obviously delayed the construction and had a bunch of influencing effects on cost base. And as well, you also had things like major flooding or the atmospheric river in British Columbia that washed away a huge portion of the pipeline kind of initial right of way. Wow. And then there were a bunch of technical issues.
So how does it compare to the Keystone Pipeline? The Keystone Pipeline obviously was coming from Canada, importing oil into the United States. Is this the same? Yep. Is it going in the same direction?
No. And that's, I think, the most important thing about it is, so right now, roughly 95+% of Canadian crude exports goes to the United States. Right. Even more than that concentration at a country level, it's something like the top 10 refineries in the United States, basically large integrated complex refineries with cokers, largely in the Midwest. 10 refineries consume roughly half of all Canadian exports. The Jolie refinery very recently that just came back online, Exxon's in Illinois, it itself consumes upwards of 8% of total Canadian crude exports. So Canadian crude exports are very concentrated, which is good because Canada and the United States, obviously long-term allies, very stable, lots of, we don't need to worry about anything else between these pipelines. The challenge is that it makes Canadian producers very vulnerable to changes in U.S. demand conditions, particularly when you have large unplanned maintenance in Pad 2 in the Midwest. Essentially, the effect is it's like disappearing pipelines because those pipelines can only go so many places. And if the end consumers at the ends of those pipes turn off for whatever reason, like let's say they catch fire or they explode, all of these things have happened, that manifests as kind of tightness in Canadian pipeline capacity, which has already been chronically tight for the past kind of 10 plus years. And for people that aren't aware, so the main pricing, so Canada's main export crude is called Western Canadian Select. It's a heavy sour dilbit, very similar in quality to Iraq's Basra heavy crude that is traded in Asia, and that'll become important in a second. This always trades at a discount to light sweet crudes like WTI. So that's not a huge surprise. Right now, at the U.S. Gulf Coast around Houston, a barrel of WCS is fetching about $6 a barrel less than a barrel of WTI equivalent or kind of WTI Midland. But where WCS primarily trades is in Hardisty in Alberta. And there you have a differential that's typically around $13 a barrel. And that accounts for the extra cost of pipeline transit, right? The challenge is that through various periods of the past 15 years, we have run acutely short of pipeline capacity. And obviously, the Permian Basin has seen this at various periods as well, where you run out of egress and you see these massive blowouts and differentials. The same thing happened to Canada. At its worst, it happened in late 2018, where we had, at one point, a $50 a barrel differential in Hardisty. So for every barrel, it was crazy. I mean, and I wrote a piece back then when I was at Scotiabank, and we're talking about tens of billions of dollars of lost opportunity cost. And because it's not just those final stranded barrels that are trading at that impacts the value of the entire basin. So you're talking tens of billions of dollars in kind of evaporated value, which is why at the time, the Alberta government actually forced curtailment across the entire province, basically pulled an OPEC and cut production by 300,000 barrels a day in order to ease that up. The worry is that without pipelines, you kind of end up in that situation permanently. That, I think, is the primary value of TMX, is that it adds 590,000 barrels a day of extra egress, one of the largest chunks of additional egress we've received in the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin in about 15, 20 years.
Now, does that come primarily out of the tar sands, or is it?
Correct. And so the Canadian oil sands, the Athabasca oil sands, we don't typically like the tar sands term up in Canada.
Right.
One of those things that environmentalists tend to throw at us. But yeah, so both the similarity between Trans Mountain Expansion (TMX) and Keystone XL (KXL) were that they were both going to be heavy crude pipelines, and that's where virtually all of Canada's incremental oil production is coming from. Is specifically it's not even heavy crude as I think a lot of Americans or even kind of global consumers would typically think about it. It's dilbit, so it's pure bitumen in many cases. It's diluted with condensate or pentanes or other things, to typically around kind of like depending on the grade, but like as a general rule, kind of 70-30 split. And that is essentially the heavy sour crude that's being pumped. It would have been pumped through KXL and is now being pumped through TMX. Now, you were asking if they were similar earlier. So that's the similarity, is the grades that they're carrying or they would have carried. The difference is that obviously Trans Mountain basically triples the oil sands access to tidewater. So those barrels, and now largely right now, they're mostly still going to California. So they're going to Pad 5. So one, that's some diversification. That's good, right? We've moved away from just being at Pad 2 and Pad 3 in the Gulf Coast, now going into Pad 5. Ironically, as a small aside here, the pipeline system was so tight that you actually had moments where Canadian crude producers were shipping all the way down to the U.S. Gulf Coast, re-exporting out the Gulf Coast and through the Panama Canal and then into Pad 5. So this is a much better, more direct route. And then finally, obviously, the big prize here is beginning to diversify away. We love our commercial partners in the United States, obviously, but it's helpful and healthy to have a little bit of choice in our end demand mix. So more and more of these barrels are heading towards Asia, primarily China and India. And I think that is the big prize here, some optionality in kind of end markets.
Can you explain a little bit for our listeners about the different gravities of crude? You know, like sweet crude is 42 gravity, and then of course different fields around the world have heavy crude, like you're speaking about, like Venezuela. You know, their crude is very heavy, and so they take that crude and they blend it, and that's how they obviously make it lighter, correct? At these refineries.
That's exactly right. So there's a bunch of I always like crude is like chemical soup, right? There's, countless differences, heavy metals, all these things. But the two main differences are API gravity or density, as you were referring to, heavy, medium, light, and then sulfur. So basically light is sweet, is low sulfur, and sour is heavy sulfur. Sulfur's bad because it causes things like acid rain. So when you had all these environmental policies that came up, one of the primary things that required was a stripping out of sulfur from these fuels. at the refinery so they don't come out of, tailpipes. Now, the other thing here is that sweetness and like the sulfur content, the heavier your barrel, typically the more sour it is. It's not a one-for-one rule, but typically it's kind of a pretty linear relationship if you look at all the grades on a chart. So WTI or Brent, very light sweet crudes, like you were saying, kind of 42, 44 API, near 0% sulfur, depending on the exact grade. That's a very valuable grade. It produces a lot of high value consumer fuels right out the gate without a bunch of really expensive refining kit or equipment. Whereas something like WCS or Mary out of Venezuela or Basra Heavy out of Iraq, these crudes are heavy sour, more like 22 to 23 degrees API. The lower the number, the heavier it is. And then obviously more like 3 to 4% sulfur, which is a lot of sulfur in the scheme of things. And that is actually one of the things that limits who can really take this crude is you need refineries that have desulfurization units that strips the sulfur out. And even more importantly, in terms of the economics, the most important single thing that refineries need to process this crude is a coker. So when basically the gravity effects, essentially when you put a crude into your distillation tower, you have like normal kind of cuts of the kind of primary products that come out. A heavy crude, that atmospheric cut or even the vacuum cut is cut, more and more of it is heavy, residual fuels or heavy gas oils or other things like that. That can be useful, but quite typically you want to put that into a coker in order to break it down even further and get more higher value things like, vacuum gas oil and all these other things that you can basically get into diesel streams in particular in order to basically upgrade the value of that barrel. So when you look at the refineries in the United States, I mentioned that 10 refineries take the vast, like half of Canadian crude exports. Those 10 refineries are also typically the 10 refineries with the largest coking units. So there's a really strong relationship there. And that's the same now that these barrels are heading over into Asia. It's going to the same types of refineries, large integrated complex refineries with large coking units, and typically trying to displace and undercut on a price basis barrels like Basra Heavy out of Iraq.
One of the safest ways to move crude is through pipelines, right? I mean, as far
Absolutely.
as that, can we talk a little bit about that? I mean, because it seems like if you're not going to have pipelines, right, you got to move it by either train or you have to move it by truck, and it seems to me pipelines make a lot more sense, as far as moving crude.
Absolutely. So, I mean, obviously, what we've seen historically is during that period where I was mentioning that the Western Canadian Sedimentary Basin, which is essentially the large region, mostly covering, Eastern British Columbia into Alberta and Western Saskatchewan, basically where the vast majority of Canadian crude is produced. During the periods where you were underpiped to that area, you had structural increases in oil by rail shipments. A lot of that was going all the way from Alberta down towards the US Gulf Coast. So these are like really, really long run trains. As you note, trains aren't as safe as pipelines, which just makes sense, right? There's just so many more moving pieces and everything else. The benefit to Dilbit is that at least the trains aren't explosive. And I think the most tragic example of what we can see in the ultimate downside for crude by rail are things like the Lac Mégantic explosion that had happened in the kind of mid 2010s, early 2010s actually, where you had trains carrying kind of lighter shale crudes, mostly from the Bakken, that derailed and exploded because of basically the higher propensity of light ends, gases, everything else. That's more explosive. The derailing of a WCS or heavy crude train, it's less of a safety issue typically and more of an environmental safety issue. So it's far harder to clean up heavy crudes because they sink to the bottom of waterways and everything else. So that's the real downside on the safety side for WCS and heavy crudes. But I think the most important difference is economic, or at least the kind of most notable one. So when you have a moment where I was mentioning earlier that essentially that last barrel of crude, price is clear on the margin. The last barrel sets the price essentially for the entire basin. So when you have a couple barrels that need to get away by crude by rail, that's more expensive than sending it through a pipeline. So what happens is you have to widen the overall differential. So I was saying earlier that that my normal kind of WCS differential that I assume is like a normal healthy discount, or what we call a discount in Canada, is $13 a barrel. When you get into oil by rail, that pushes up towards $18 to $20 a barrel. So a very kind of 50+% increase in the differential, and that goes right down the bottom line for Canadian oil producers. So oil barrels are very expensive, which is why we don't want to rely on it. And then obviously in 2018, we had our needs outstripped even oil by rail. You had a bunch of things that were holding it up. So then that's where you got to 50. And that's basically where, there was a piece in Bloomberg back when you had big differential blowouts in Midland for when you had the Permian pipeline capacity issues. And you could basically have a trade where you basically put 4 barrels of crude, 6 barrels of crude in the back of a pickup truck. And you could drive them to Cushing and basically arbitrage that value. That's essentially, you basically need really, really big differentials to give the market a correct signal and incentive to figure out how to clear that physical overhang. And that's essentially what we're trying to avoid.
Yeah, I know we've seen a lot of that up in the Bakken, as far as the differential cost of, the takeaway of depending on how you're moving it. And I know the operators for a while, they were trying to rail their oil, down to the Gulf Coast because they were getting basically Brent prices, in the Gulf Coast compared to the differential costs they were getting hammered with up in the Bakken.
That's exactly right. And basically so I always view, WCS primarily through the lens of the differential. And you can have a bunch of different things that affect it. I think you have 2 prices, right? You have the price of WCS in Hardisty in Alberta, and you have the price of WCS in Cushing or at the US Gulf Coast. I think if you take the difference between those prices, that's essentially what I call like the pipeline incentive or transportation differential. Whereas the differential at Houston is what I call the quality differential. And that's based that, even barrel for barrel, you're going to have differences in value. And those differences can swing pretty notably. I think, this past December, you had a big rout in the value of WCS at the Gulf Coast. We blew out to like $11 a barrel just on the quality basis. And last year was even worse. I think at the end of 2022, it was something like negative $25 a barrel just in the quality differential. So all this being said, that there are other things that affect the marketability or economics of Canadian crude that we can't really affect or we can't really control. But pipelines are the one thing that, one, is a predictable kind of persistent problem for us and is well within our control. We can do something about it, and we should do something about it.
So when the oil, I don't want to get too technical here, but when the oil purchaser, say the operator sells his oil in Canada, and he's getting this differential price because of the heaviness of the crude. When they bring that crude down to the Gulf Coast, whether it be by pipeline, of course, there's a fee to bring it down, but when it gets there, they blend it with lighter crudes, and then, of course, they sell it. So the operator doesn't really benefit on that, right? He just takes his crude and he sells it at the wellhead.
At the Hardisty price, basically. Yeah, so I think there are moments, depending on the size of the producer. So the large producers, Suncor, Canadian Natural Resources, Cenovus, et cetera, they have contracted capacity on a lot of the major pipelines. They can basically get out. But you're absolutely right that a lot of the pipeline capacity is also owned by major U.S. refiners or merchant trading houses like Trafigura and others. If you are a producer that can only basically get, if you don't have any pipeline capacity or rail, then you are absolutely right. You only see that Hardisty price and potentially even less if someone else is taking it, because it costs money to get it from the wellhead to the hub in Hardisty. So if you can't do that, then you're taking an additional hit there. I mean, a lot of this is done by shippers, which are sometimes the operators, but not always.
I see. That's interesting. So this pipeline is up and running now, right? I mean, it
is.
Are there plans to build other pipelines?
If only. That's the big problem, right? So this is, as I was mentioning, this is the biggest kind of single chunk increase that we've seen in more than a decade. The only previous pipeline we had recently was Enbridge's. The main line had a replacement of line 3, which added about 300,000 barrels a day of additional capacity. But beyond that, there's really not much currently in the works. There was recently announced, so the Enbridge main line is massive. It's like more than 3 million barrels a day of capacity in the system. And that's what gets the majority of Canadian crude to market. It's 3-4 times larger than Keystone. That I think, where we're going to see any increases in egress capacity, it's mostly going to be in the main line in terms of debottlenecking and logistical improvements that increase its functional capacity. Enbridge just announced one that's supposed to add about 150,000 barrels a day of capacity in late 26, early 27. And then finally, on top of that, right now, the Trans Mountain Pipeline, 80% of it is contracted capacity, so basically take or pay. And then the final 20% of the pipeline is spot capacity. And I mentioned earlier, these cost overruns were such that the tolls on this pipeline that have been approved by the Canadian Energy Regulator are more than twice as high as when many of the shippers initially agreed to the contracts. So that's been a big downside for them, and why right now you basically don't have any of the spot capacity on TMX being used. So there's another chunk of like 100,000 barrels, give or take, of capacity in the spot, about 120,000 barrels a day. And then you're going to get another 150 from Enbridge on the main line. But beyond that, there's really not much. I've been told by people that know the systems that you can probably you can find even more. Like mainline is so big and complicated that you can find additional debottlenecking efforts there, or drag reduction agents or things like that can increase flow rates. And as well, you can probably increase capacity on TMX slightly. But I've been pushing now for a while that, for the past decade, we knew we had issues, and we had 3 different big pipelines coming down the pipe, if you pardon the pun. But now we can once again see that we're going to very likely run out of pipeline capacity, potentially as soon as 26, 27. And we now have no pipelines working their way through the system. So I think that's the big challenge for the Canadian industry looking forward.
So if Trump gets reelected, do you see the Keystone Pipeline being resurrected? One more time?
One more. Yeah, I would like to say, like, what is dead can never die, right? And I think this. Do I see Keystone XL being built? Probably not. Do I see, if Trump wins, do I see them talking about it again? Absolutely. I think Keystone XL has to be the most famous pipeline in the universe at this stage. And I think it's so much more than a pipeline. It's a political symbol for both the left and the right. And I think the left, regardless of any other evidence, the left will lean against it and the right will lean in support of it. But at this stage, you'd need TC Energy, the initial proponent, to actually build the thing. And everyone's taken massive write-offs and kind of losses on this pipeline already. And up until recently, at least they still have the pipe hanging around there waiting to build it. As I understand it, they've it's been a really tight market for pipe and kind of and these tubular goods. So they sold that stuff. So you would need to get an approval, and then you need to find all the equipment, the crew, everything else, and then you need to still go through the state approvals and all the headache. Not saying it's impossible, because everything is possible in oil, but it would be a very, very uphill battle. And I can't imagine a private sector actor taking on the risk without some kind of abnormal and extraordinary guarantees.
Yeah, I agree with you. Well, can you tell our listeners how to follow you, Roy?
Yeah, so I tweet a lot, probably too much, on Twitter at Rory_Johnston. And you can follow all of my oil market research at commoditycontext.com. And I'm publishing on Substack. I publish about 2 pieces a week, a weekly wrap-up on Friday, and thematic and data work. And then I'm also building out a data product and institutional advisory practice as well. So if you need more help on oil markets, and specifically in the Canadian market, give me a call.
Well, great to have you on the show today, and love to have you back in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, and I'm happy to come back.
Thank you.
This podcast is a presentation of Rich Dad Media Network.